correspondent from CNN who used to work for CNN, and she is an Emmy winner, award-winning journalist who covered the Middle East for many, many, many years. And it's a real pleasure and honour to have her in the studio. Arwa Damon, welcome to Leicester.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for coming in and the opportunity to talk to you. Arwa, just give a little bit of background about Arwa Damon. How did you end up in journalism, and how did you end up covering the whole of the Middle East for many, many years?
You know, it wasn't ever a plan. So for people who don't know me, I am Syrian American. My mother's Syrian, my dad's American, and I grew up very, bicultural. Like our household was always, and I like to say this, breakfast was Lebanon za'atar and blueberry pancakes. And I didn't really know what I wanted to do in my life. We moved around a lot. I spent my middle school, primary school, teenage years in Morocco and in Turkey. And then I went to the U.S. for college. I studied biology and French, landed in New York, working for a Turkish textile company, which is basically just a fancy way of saying I sold bathrobes and towels. And then 9/11 happened. And I very quickly saw the dehumanization of the other, especially as the U.S. went from the war in Afghanistan to the war in Iraq. And that's when I ended up with this almost, overwhelming, visceral need to be there to help explain people to each other. And that's basically how I decided to be a journalist. And of course, everyone said I was crazy. I wouldn't make it. I needed to go get experience. I needed to do this. I needed to do that. But long story very short is I did manage to get myself over there. And that's how I started my journalism career in 2003. And well, unfortunately, tragedy in the Middle East never ended, and I found myself spending the vast majority of my time there.
And you talk about dehumanization. What do you actually mean that you felt that people weren't human anymore because of what?
I felt that people were being portrayed as somehow less than. And let me be even clearer about that. People who were Arab, Muslim, brown, or basically non-white, were being portrayed as somehow less than, less deserving, as if they didn't love, laugh, or live in the same way. And for me, and let's be very blunt about this, I mean, you're staring at me right now, I look like the American girl next door. And I found myself in a position where I was able to say things that were actually about myself, about how I was raised, about who I am, about my own Arab identity, that resonated with people where they were more willing to listen to me because I looked like them. And
exactly.
It didn't make sense, but I realized that maybe this was something I could use to my advantage.
And you were incredibly successful. 5 Emmy awards for your journalism. What were they in?
I mean, look, a lot of people list the awards and the accolades, and I mean, yes, there's 5 Emmys, there's an Investigative Reporters and Editors Award, there's a Gracie, there's, the Courage in Journalism Award. A lot of it was because of my work focusing on the human story. And a lot of journalists talk about how, they want to focus on the human story. But I think that I was able to, mostly because of my background and my ability to actually be an Arabic speaker, my willingness to just engage with anybody, able to draw out a lot of nuance in terms of what does it really feel like to have everything ripped away from you by war, by politics, by circumstances that are completely outside of your control. What does it feel like to go and all of a sudden, in an instant, have no control over your life and have just about everyone and everything around you want to keep crushing you down, and yet you somehow persevere? And the thing that I always, love to talk about, and I'm always so grateful when I'm able to capture these moments on camera and include them in our reports, are the moments that people don't expect to see. And by that I mean you expect to see, when it comes to, frontline war zone reporting, the bombings, the explosions, the people being pulled out from underneath the rubble, the tragedy, the blood-soaked scenes at hospitals. But what you don't expect to see and what people don't really realize is how much kindness and compassion exists there. You don't expect to see the mother who is completely and totally overwhelmed by tragedy through her tears say, "But can I offer you a cup of coffee? You're my guest." You don't expect to see the way that, someone who has been displaced multiple times over and over and over again, all of a sudden will say, "I'm so sorry, I have nothing to offer you, but please come into my home." You don't expect to see the dark sense of humor, the laughter, and all of it.
That must be really, really tough.
It look, it's always emotional to be in that space, but it's something that I've recognized, and I did recognize early on. I'm not going to say that it's not tough on a personal level, but it's a choice. I insert myself into these spaces by choice, and that choice is such a privilege. I mean, look, now I know we're going to talk more about Gaza.
But the thing is, you actually explain and visually portray the image that the sort of the American image, but at the same time you have the empathy and the compassion and the concern for the people who are thousands of miles away from America. Let's face it, and you can reflect that in your reporting, which is a huge sort of step forward, just to explain, be able to do that.
Yes, but again, it's it's a choice, and I think I'm very cognizant of that. And when you kind of reflect on where you are, you're able to draw that out a bit more. I would go into Syria, for example, when we just crossed the border from Turkey into Syria, and all of a sudden, just like that, you drive 20 minutes, and the Russians and the Assad regime are bombing. This was a few years ago. You're in the hospital, and babies are crying, and children are on life-saving machines, but they're beeping and they're about to take their last breath. And then all of a sudden, 20 minutes later, you're back in Turkey, and you're in a hotel room, and you have food, and you have a hot shower, and you have all of these things. And in reflecting on that, and in recognizing these small details in people's lives that others don't think about, I'll never forget one father who I met who had been living in a tent for years. And I asked him, what do you miss? And he said, "I miss being able to lean back." And it took me a second. But then it was like, of course, you're in a tent. There's nothing to lean back on. He is not. And it's those little things. It's drawing out those little details. It's recognizing that, a child who is 3 years old, who has been woken up in the middle of the night because of bombings, in the freezing cold, has had to walk or be carried for hours without proper shoes on, is hungry. It's recognizing that that child should be crying, but they're not, because that's the depth of their trauma.
Yeah. And, as a journalist, you did many, many years as a journalist and saw all of this in front of your eyes. How difficult was that when you're not able to actually do anything for them? And is that why you came out of journalism effectively?
So, yes, is the short answer. Yes and no. So, as a journalist, I think, a lot of us, we start in the industry, and we're young, we're naive, we're idealistic, and we sort of fundamentally believe in, if the world sees what's happening,
that things will change.
Things will change. And then you very quickly become bitter and disenchanted. But you keep going out there. And I think for me, at one point, you realize that you're not going to change the world. But I would always go back and keep reporting, stories where some of my colleagues had moved on from, especially those that were trying to kind of like build up, their careers, because I stayed on stories that basically I was always told no one cares about it. And I had to question myself as to, like, why do I keep going back and reporting these things? And I kind of landed on the idea of, the victors cannot be the only ones whose version of history is out there. And there is merit in telling someone's story, even if that does not bring about change, because one day it might bring about accountability, or it might be the right moral thing to do. And I think for me, that was a big driver. But yes, very much so. It was especially after reporting Syria. So I spent roughly, 7 years based out of Baghdad from 2003 to 2010, and then I moved to Beirut, and then very quickly we had the uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt, Libya, Syria, and I was in Syria quite a few times illegally. Because the Assad regime back then did not want us covering what was really happening. And so I had, done anything from, sneaking across borders to crawling through sewage lines to try to get to neighborhoods that were under siege. And there was something that was just so crushing about how hard Syrians were trying to get the news out, how hard Syria's citizen journalists were trying to just, get that one shot of a tank so that they could prove to the world that, no, they were being fired on. And it was really that experience that kind of sank me into this dark vortex of what am I doing? And what more can I or should I be doing? And then, yes, out of that emerged an idea, back when I was still at CNN, of starting a charity. Because a lot of us who are out there in the field, we do actually come across kids who have been injured who aren't getting the medical care that they need. And so why not initially, build something where when we're out there in the field and we come across these cases, we can just plug them straight into it.
Yeah. And that's the start of it, really.
Yes.
And as a journalist and being there on the ground, speaking the language, knowing, why do you think sometimes the world just keeps quiet on those horrific incidents that do happen, or the incidents that happen in front of your eyes as a journalist? Is it just there's not enough information about it, or is it the credibility of the information? What is it actually that drives the sort of the decisions made in governments, really? Isn't it not enough?
The media spotlight is a very strange beast. And actually, warring parties, politicians, anyone with, sort of a nefarious intent is also very well aware of the fact that the media spotlight does move on and that there's viewer apathy at some point that will sort of force the media spotlight to move on. And this is a strategy that we've actually, seen employed quite often in war zones. Even a war like Iraq that the U.S. was so entrenched in, the U.S. media, after a few years, all of a sudden it was like, oh no, the viewers don't want to hear about, all of the bad news coming out of Iraq. You look at, the Russians are very good at using this strategy, knowing that the spotlight is eventually going to move away.
Is it almost like a propaganda then, do you think, that moves on?
It's not necessarily propaganda that moves on per se. It's knowing that they can exploit and manipulate the viewers' own sense of sort of helplessness, hopelessness. I can't deal with this anymore. I don't want to hear about this anymore. Coupled with, let's face it, especially if we're talking about the Western media, a certain level of bias, and you will see this, especially for, international organizations where, a shooting or an explosion that kills, let's again be very open about this, white people is going to get a lot more attention than one that happens in Pakistan or, in Nigeria or that kind of thing, a few exceptions aside. And we see this all the time. And there are, journalists within these sort of big mainstream media organizations that continue to lobby very, very hard, myself included back in, my CNN days, for these other stories to also be able to get the airtime that they merit. But it's a constant challenge. And you have this sort of bizarre relationship, especially again when it comes to sort of the big media giants, between what they are journalistically obligated to report versus what viewers or they perceive viewers want to see, which then translates into how many viewers they have, which then translates into ad revenue.
And obviously the big story, without question of doubt, has been the Middle East and Gaza currently in a situation. You've been out there
Mm.
over the last couple of years during this current war. How did you find it the first time and the second time, and how much has it differed over those 4 times? And overall, how long were you there? Have you? I mean, you know, were you there for a few days, or were you there for a few weeks each time?
So I think, I mean, let's be clear about one thing. First of all, the foreign media has not been allowed into Gaza. And that's not to take away from the work that Palestinian journalists have been doing and risking their lives for. You know, Gaza is the deadliest.
And they are risking their lives.
They are,
Yeah.
and the Committee to Protect Journalists has at least 24 cases where they have managed to verify, among the hundreds of journalists who have been killed, but at least 24 cases where it was a deliberate assassination attempt. But the reality is that the foreign media, especially the Western media, has by and large been subjected to a very robust campaign to discredit their Palestinian colleagues. And that campaign has largely been carried out by Israel and by its allies. You know, just recently you had one of Israel's spokespeople coming out, you know, in the media and basically saying any news that comes out of Gaza is controlled by Hamas. And the foreign press hasn't really been pushing hard enough, I would argue, to actually get access into Gaza, although there has been a bit more of an effort right now for it. But what that basically, you know, has meant was that the story of Gaza is, yes, being told through the eyes of its own people and its own journalists, but also has been, you know, incredibly challenging when it comes to trying to break through some of the narratives that sort of led us to where we are in Gaza today. So I went to Gaza on 4 humanitarian missions with my charity, Inara. And this was all in 2004. I tried to go in February and in March of this past year, but I was denied entry by Israel. No reason was given to me. At the time, roughly 30% of people who were attempting to go in on medical and humanitarian missions were being denied entry. Right now, that number is up to 50%. Each trip, it varied. I probably spent a total of maybe 2.5 months there.
That's quite a lot of time over the last 18 months, 2 years for that. That's a long time you spent there. I would have thought, you know, and how did you manage to stay there for that long? Because that is a long time.
I mean, yes and no. You know, I'm sorry, I'm like drifting off into
because
into
there's no
some
running. There's
memories.
no. There's probably no running water or no facilities or
No, so
anything.
I mean, look, it's a bit different for us, right? So, you know, I would go in on humanitarian missions, and I would stay with a partner organization who had a guest house.
Okay. So it'd be easier. Yeah.
Compared to what Gaza citizens are going through,
Okay.
absolutely, you know, 100%. So, you know, we had water, we had solar panels, we had a generator that sometimes had fuel, sometimes didn't have fuel. In terms of food, we had access to more or less the same food, in the sense that it was what was in, you know, food parcels, and then depending on, you know, what's in the market, which were at exorbitant prices, but we can access them. The thing is you don't. I mean, at least I didn't think about that when I was there, because whatever it is that, you know, you're going through, you're first of all highly cognizant of the fact that you have it better than everybody else.
And I think that's the point, isn't it? Really, because you feel that you're so much better off than the people who are there, that you actually just carry on as normal, don't you? Is that the way you probably felt?
No, it didn't resonate with me that it was hard for me.
Yes.
At all.
No.
What resonated with me and what kept me there was the small moments that I would have, either like with my team or when we were out among the people. Um, my team, whether it's in Gaza or elsewhere, they always kind of joke that I come and I bring chaos, in the sense that, we'll be doing a distribution somewhere, but then I'll always peel off and, start cracking jokes with the women or playing with the kids and just trying to have these sort of
happier moments,
basic interactions. You know, I don't think people on the outside realize how much someone appreciates it when you come in and you just kind of like flop down next to them as if you were having a normal interaction that's not I've got and you need, along those lines. And then, I also don't think, especially when it comes to Gaza, I don't think people realize how gracious and compassionate the population is. I remember we went into one tent. The family had come out and asked us if we could help them get sort of a second tent, because they had a teenager who'd been shot and was, partially paralyzed. And I remember I went in and, I was, laughing and joking with, this 16, 17-year-old who was lying in bed. I mean, completely miserable, and then I turned around and I was apologizing to his older brother, saying, like, I'm sorry we don't have any tents right now. And he just kind of looked at me and said, that's okay. At least you made him smile. And you realize that sometimes that's all you have to give, and it's nothing, but it actually is a tiny little bit of something.
Do you feel sometimes that when you're there, that people think then that people outside of Gaza care about them and are worried about them? Or do you feel that doesn't get across?
No, it does. It does. But I mean, look, Gaza, I don't know how many people are aware of this, but Gaza actually has one of the highest, percentage-wise, levels of literate people. I mean, Gazans are highly educated. Everybody is taught that your education is your ticket. And they value their education so much. And it is so precious to them. And that's why, literally, I mean, kids, teenagers, college kids are absolutely gutted over the fact that, it's basically come to a standstill. And they're very media savvy, and they're very social media savvy. So they kind of have a solid enough grasp on what's happening on the outside. And so they're very well aware of the fact that, yes, public opinion is starting to shift. Yes, there's people out there who are advocating for them. And all equally so, that no one and no government is doing enough to sort of break the hold on their future that Israel and the U.S. has.
Yeah, and how how have you seen Gaza change in those 4 visits? From what it was to what it is now, because you see all these aerial photos, you see lots of things, but what is it really actually like? Because from the outside, it's really difficult to tell. You've been there, so
no, I mean. The first time I went in was in April of 2024. And I remember even back then thinking, my God, it's like the apocalypse. Like, it's just this weird dystopian existence. And the thing is, I've been to a lot of war zones, right? Like, I saw the aftermath of, Fallujah in 2004. I've, seen Baba Ahmed in Syria in 2012. I saw the battles, against ISIS in Mosul in 2016. And so I'm very familiar, unfortunately, with what, war and bombings and fighting does to a place and a population. And I remember that first trip trying to figure out what it was that made Gaza so different. And I remember looking out the car, like, in my first 15 minutes there. And this is back, when everyone was down in the Rafah area before the Israelis then invaded Rafah and forced everybody out. And you had roughly 1 million people who were down there, and the car was inching forward very slowly. And so the people kind of like part in front of it. And I have a habit of kind of like, I'll look out the window and I'll make eye contact with somebody. And then, like smile or wave. People's eyes were dead. And that was what I had never seen before. I had not seen that level of death of soul and spirit. And I remember talking to a friend of mine, Hanya, who's obviously from Gaza. And I was like, was it just me? And she goes, no. She goes, we're zombies. We are zombies. Because even back then, people's souls were so crushed, or they had to crush their own pain. I remember that trip, I met a mother who came up knowing that we do a lot of work with children in mental health. She kind of grabbed my arm and she was saying, I don't know what to do about my son. He's 7 years old. And every night he grabs his hair and he's rocking back and forth. And he's screaming, and I think he's just going to, have a fit or a seizure. And he's been like this ever since he saw his younger sister's head pop off. And she says this in a very sort of deadpan tone of voice. And I asked her, I was like, she's talking about her daughter. And I asked her, where were you? And she says, oh, I was there. And I must have had a very, shocked expression on my face, because then she just looked at me and she said, I know, but I can't. And what she meant was she can't even let the tiniest bit of emotion into her voice, because if she does, she will break. And if she breaks, she will crack. And if she cracks, she's not going to be able to support the rest of her family that needs her. And so, that was over a year ago. And each trip back, things are exponentially worse. But we'd already used all of our words that we had in the vocabulary covering those early few months. I mean, how do you describe dystopia upon dystopia upon dystopia? How do you describe what's happening
Destruction,
there right now, beyond the destruction, but the sheer lunacy of ordering roughly 1 million people in Gaza City to move south, dropping leaflets that tell them in the south you will find a safe zone. And this safe zone is going to have tents and food and water and access to medical care. That doesn't exist. That does not exist in Gaza, and it never has. I have my own staff, obviously, because we have a operation in
charity
Gaza
there,
City. And we have a field medical clinic that does primary care, and then we do a lot of other activities and distributions. And so, our physical therapist the other day was trying to go south to look for a space
to operate from.
No, to live. They're going to have to live.
Okay.
I mean, the staff is going to have to move. It took him 12 hours just to get to the south. Keeping in mind, he has access to a salary. Obviously, he's employed. But it took him 12 hours to get to the south, to look for a tiny little piece of land, to then negotiate to be able to rent that piece of land, and then he needs to find a tent to put on it.
That land.
And he still hasn't secured that. Just to give you an idea, if you want to rent something with 4 wheels to actually go south, if you're going to rent a donkey cart to go south, you're paying $700. If you're going to rent like a tractor or a truck or this or that, you're talking upwards of $1,000 to move.
How is law and order in a country like that?
That's what I have found so admirable each trip back, because I was convinced that there was going to be a complete and total descent into anarchy, especially the more sort of hunger began to set in, and scarcity just became completely overwhelming. And I think a few instances aside, we haven't really seen that. And it's quite stunning when you compare what Gaza and its people are going through to, say, for example, COVID in the U.S., where people went crazy and were fighting each other over toilet paper. You look at Gaza and, yes, we of course, there have been now, especially, desperate crowds swarming around aid trucks. But at the same time, you don't have this sort of massive descent into anarchy. And I think that says a lot to who the people of Gaza really are.
You're listening to Radio Ramadan. We're talking to Arwa Damon about her experiences in Gaza, and she's bringing us back her life recollections of being in Gaza. She's been in Gaza almost over 2.5 months in the last 2 years while the war has gone on. And Arwa, you describe some of those things. How do people charge their mobile phones? How do they, because there's no electricity, no water, how do they get around just the basics?
So there are these, it's these weird little industries kind of, crop up. So there's charging stations. So somebody, for example, who has managed to save their solar panel. There's also, let's remember, before all of this, a lot of families, people had solar panels. And so someone who's managed to save their solar panel
off their roof,
of their roof.
Yeah. Even though the building's probably no longer there?
Correct.
Okay.
So, but you have to remember that people were being displaced, from the very beginning.
So they would take them with them, would they?
They would take them with them, yeah.
Okay.
And in the very, I'm talking about in the first, month or two, people still were able to use their cars. And people actually evacuated, fairly quickly in some areas because they also know, right? They know that whenever Hamas launches an attack, Israel is going to counterstrike, and they're going to have to, evacuate for the most part. So some people manage to salvage their solar panels, and so they'll set up charging stations where you have a single solar panel with, a cable, and that's how you're charging your cell phone. My charity, Inada, actually, we set up solar panels at a couple of the sort of makeshift tent clusters that we work at so that people could charge their cell phones, but also because we had a bunch of cases in these areas of people who needed their medical devices charged. We had a couple of kids who have hearing aids. They need to be charged. A couple of people who need I forget what it's called, like if you're asthmatic or have trouble breathing at night, you need that device to be charged. So some organizations have also gone out and set up solar panels for certain shelters. But no, you go around and you scrounge for a charging station. Same for, internet access stations. All these little industries have sort of, popped up and allow people a certain level of, functionality, but it's below the bare minimum of what you need.
We have a message coming in, and we have lots of charities here in Leicester. Leicester is a centre of, charitable donations generally, and is very, very giving to all causes. Leicester collecting money for Gaza and the West Bank, but the news telling us no aid is getting into Gaza. So how can we know if the money donated is getting to the people in these places?
It's a very fair question. And it is true. Very little aid is actually getting into Gaza, physically into Gaza. But for example, what do we have? Like, how is my charity been spending the money and the donations that we get? So when we're not able to get our trucks in, what we do is we look at what we can purchase locally. So for example, in April, we bought up diapers.
Nappies.
Nappies, yes.
Nappies, the American word is
nappies.
Yes.
Diapers. Okay,
yes.
Nappies here.
Yes.
We bought up nappies. And because the team could foresee that there was going to be a severe shortage. Now, just to give you an idea, when we bought them up at roughly $25 a pack.
Wow.
So
that's incredibly expensive in comparison.
Yeah, so I don't know what that ends up being in pounds.
Yeah.
Now, we bought them
£20.
We bought them up in March. Fast forward to last month when we finished distributing everything that we actually had in stock. That same pack on the market was costing $165.
Whoa.
There is bizarrely
because of the shortage, prices are going up.
No, it's always been, Gaza has always been an industry of scarcity. And this scarcity is and has been deliberately orchestrated by Israel, right? Like you don't let aid trucks in. All of a sudden, aid has a value on the market. All of a sudden, you have the looting that takes place. But what does happen on occasion is commercial trucks are let in. So right now, for example, yes, it's very true. Very few organizations are actually able to get their aid trucks into Gaza, but commercial trucks have been going in.
Oh, so business trucks are allowed in for commercial selling, but no charitable, effectively.
Very few
Okay.
trucks are going in for humanitarian organizations. You now can find certain items on the market because commercial trucks have been allowed to go in. Yes.
Okay.
So it's very bizarre.
That sounds really odd.
It's Gaza. Nothing about any logic you would want to apply actually makes sense. But so, for example, so you can find some things locally. Very few people know this, but Gaza used to have a very robust agricultural industry. And a lot of the greenhouses are now in, Israeli red zones, inaccessible, but there are some that are still accessible.
The greenhouses. Yeah.
So, tomatoes, cucumbers, this, that. And so, when a new harvest comes up, all of a sudden that produce appears on the market. And so what do organizations like mine do? We actually go out and buy that. But again, prices are insane. We did a fresh vegetable parcel distribution a few months ago where we paid $80 for 7 kilos of fresh vegetables.
Right.
We did it a few weeks ago. We paid $135.
Almost double, yeah.
Almost double. And again, we're talking, 6 kilos of vegetables.
Yeah.
And so that's how we spend, the money inside
So
when we're not able to
it would be
bring
fair to
trucks in.
say that actually your money doesn't go very far in a place like Gaza at this moment in time.
No, I mean, if you want to look at what you're going to get, on your dollar,
Yeah.
no, it's not going to go very far. But I mean,
There's no choice.
There is no choice.
There is no choice.
There is no choice. And so when it comes to work that my charity does, so we obviously have like the work that we're doing inside Gaza itself. And then we also have the work that we're doing in Egypt and in Turkey. So in Egypt, for example, we have right now roughly 360 children who are getting medical surgeries.
From Gaza.
From Gaza.
From Gaza. So you take them out of the war zone, effectively, and you take them...
Well, we need to be clear about this too, because it's a bit misleading for any organization to say that it is actually actively taking children out of Gaza. People do get out of Gaza who have been injured, and some organizations will advocate for cases that they want to take and sort of bump them up the priority list. What we do, though, is because a lot of, these kids did end up evacuating to Egypt, is we are going through and looking at, who's in Egypt's public hospitals and not receiving the level of care that they need. Or, sometimes families have managed to get themselves out. But either way, we have 360, ongoing medical cases. We've managed to open up 2 schools right now where it's children from Gaza being taught by teachers from Gaza. We're providing housing, we're providing this, we're providing
And that's
that.
in?
So that's in
Cairo.
And so even if, like, when it comes to Inara, even if your donation is not, like, even if we can't spend it right away in Gaza, it is being spent on the children and the civilians there. And I know there's also, and putting Inara to a side, I know there was this idea of like, oh, well, aid's not getting in, we shouldn't donate now. No, because aid will get in one day. And we said this from the very beginning, actually, of the war. We said to our donors initially, before we had even built up a proper response, we said, we want your donations now because we know we're going to need this money. And we also know from our experience and my personal experience working in other war zones that people are going to get tired of the story and they're just going to turn away and they're going to go back to their lives.
Yeah, so this way it protects
the
charitable donation
of the programs that we're building, because you don't want a kid who you've taken in who's going to probably need 6 surgeries due to their horrific burn injuries to all of a sudden run out of money on surgery 3. Kids, people don't realize this. Like, if you have had your limb amputated, you're probably going to need 5 or 6 surgeries throughout the course of your life as you are growing, especially if you're a child. So we especially at Inara, we want to build something sustainable. We want to be able to provide all aspects of what that child actually needs to be able to overcome, to the best of their ability, physical and psychological injury.
That is really great insight, and actually it does sort of answer the question that keep giving the money, keep supporting those charities, because that money will come in use. Otherwise, it will get forgotten.
It will, and I'll say this over and over again. No, even if we cannot physically get an aid truck into Gaza, your money isn't just sitting there. Especially for the smaller organizations, we're running around, we're making things happen, we're buying up food, we're distributing hot meals. We are spending the money.
Another question coming in: who are the charities working right now in Palestine that you have seen in the field that we can trust?
I mean, it's a good question. Look, I'm obviously always going to say, like, you can trust us, you can trust Inara, but there are others who are doing extraordinary work, especially the local community charities that have popped up. I mean, the way that the people of Gaza have sort of rallied together and built up, their community kitchens to augment what the World Central Kitchen is doing. The way that, organizations, like, there's this incredible, skateboarding, club that was in Gaza that is now turned around and is also doing, distributions and activities for children. There's an incredible organization called the Gaza Sunbirds, and they're actually a team they were a paracycling team.
Yeah.
Of people who lost their
limbs and their cycling
in other bombings, but they have completely transformed that, and they have bicycles, which means they have transportation.
Yeah, so they can get from A to B.
So they're doing like amazing work on the ground, just reaching out to their own communities. There's a lot of these sort of smaller efforts. The tragedy, obviously, and like I do need to say this, is that there's also a lot of scam artists who are out there, which is disgusting. But we see this in every single war zone. I saw this in Syria.
I think that's across the world, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, it exists everywhere. People will exploit. But I have to say, those local efforts are extraordinary. And then, obviously, like, we're there. Our team is there. And I just have so much respect. And I have to share one story about kind of like why I love my team so much. So it's the height of famine, and a woman shows up at our medical clinic, and she's absolutely hysterical. And so Yusta, our program coordinator, goes with her to her house, and she is showing, like, she has two twin boys. They have a disgusting diaper rash. They've been sitting in their pee-soaked nappies. They have diarrhea. And so we go and we, like, scrounge around and get diapers and baby powder. And one of the teenage boys there says to Yusta, it's my birthday. And his mom says, you know what he asked me for his birthday? He asked me for bread. He didn't even ask me for a cake. And Yusta, on her own time the next day, even though she has two little boys of her own, goes around, looks for bread to bring back to this little boy, puts the loaves on top of each other, and sticks a candle in them because it's his birthday.
Wow. The humanity in a difficult situation. Totally. I'm going to talk to you about Afghanistan, which is also featuring on the news at the moment, with all the aid being removed by different countries across the world. What is the situation? I know you've got a team out there. What are they doing, and how are they helping in this earthquake as well?
Yeah, so there
was a disaster before a disaster.
Yeah. I mean, Afghanistan is sort of disaster upon disaster upon disaster. You obviously had the first sort of line of it is that there was never enough humanitarian aid for Afghanistan to begin with. Targets were never actually met, and then obviously the Taliban takes over. A lot of organizations end up withdrawing, and then you have the U.S. pulling its funding, which basically brought a lot of organizations that were working in Afghanistan to their knees, destroyed a lot of programs that were sort of trying to work around and protect women and girls. And then you had this horrible earthquake that happened in Kunar province. But even before that, you had Pakistan and Iran, who sent back millions of Afghan refugees, forcibly sent them back home into nothingness. And so we had a team in Kabul who then went to the earthquake zone and was kind of trying to figure out how to mount the response that we could. I mean, it's so painful. So they were going around the hospitals there, the public hospitals that a lot of the injured were taken to. I mean, these hospitals don't even have enough money or funding to actually be able to provide patients with the medications that they need. So our team, went out and had like the list of medications that the hospital requires, list of medications that the patients
Need.
are being prescribed. So we were distributing that. We were doing a lot of cash distributions.
But do you actually have enough money?
No, we don't.
To actually do that? Because medication is so expensive.
It's cheaper. It's cheaper in Afghanistan than it is here. That's
Yeah,
sure.
no. But even then, relatively,
I mean, yes, of course. No. For someone from Afghanistan to be able to afford, yes, absolutely. And Afghanistan has always been hard to fundraise for, and now even more so.
And do you think people have forgotten about Afghanistan?
I think people never really paid attention to Afghanistan, and that's the tragedy of it all. If you look at what happened when the Taliban took over and those horrible images of people holding onto a plane just that desperate to get out of their country, I mean, that faded from the world view very, very quickly.
Do you think it's the world who's just said, oh, right, okay, we don't want to deal with the Taliban. We'll put them to one side and we'll carry on?
I think,
And
it's a couple of things. I mean, one, governments have been able to very easily shirk their responsibility towards the Afghan people.
It's sort of humanitarian aid.
For humanitarian aid, but also, a sense of responsibility towards the population, which even though, countries like the U.S. will deny this, the U.S. and its allies did, even though they deny it, promise Afghans a better future and then abandon them. And I'm talking about abandonment on the most basic level. There are tens of thousands of Afghans who had to flee their own country because they were working either with the U.S. or with other Western governments,
including the
or
British,
with the security forces and with the Brits, yes, who were then promised asylum in these respective countries because they will get killed if they go back to Afghanistan. Only a fraction of those people have actually been able to move and set themselves up in the U.S. or across Europe or
so
here
do
in
you
the
think
UK.
do you think that these governments made false promises to these people?
Absolutely. And I think there's no doubt in their mind that they were also made false promises to.
But the world is changing at this moment in time. Donald Trump's taken over in the US. There's lots of governments going towards the right, and lots of governments saying, look, we just can't afford this humanitarian aid to these countries.
That's true. And my counter to that is fundamentally, I believe, a wrong perspective. But if our governments are going to fail, does that mean that we need to fail alongside them? And that's what I actually argue, because if our governments are failing, that's when we need to step up. And by we, I mean we, the average citizen. I mean we, privately owned businesses. I mean, sort of the global we needs to realize that we cannot and should not abdicate responsibility by just saying, oh, our government is not fulfilling what needs to be fulfilled. Look, when the U.S. cut its funding from Afghanistan, 400 medical points clinics had to shut down. That completely and totally eliminated access to basic health care. It's
been reported on the BBC today, as it happens in the UK. There is the BBC reporting on these clinics closing and the effect it's having on people.
In the earthquake zone alone, you have roughly 33,000. This is just in the earthquake zone, mind you. 33,000 children who are at risk of malnutrition. You have at least 10,000 mothers who are breastfeeding, who are now currently at risk. This is just in the earthquake zone. Our team went to the hospital. There are 280 children who have lost one or both parents from this earthquake. Right? We're trying to build a program to, at the very least, support those kids who are injured and have lost, their immediate family. And so, but raising money, I mean, we can't turn to the traditional sort of actors that we used to turn to because they don't exist anymore. We really need, and again, I'm talking about the global we, really need to realize that we cannot keep saying this is someone else's problem. No, if you want something to change, you change it. And maybe that's just by, giving £5. Or maybe it's by pledging, 1% of your company's revenue to a charity, any charity. But we need to realize that we need to start shouldering the burden and the responsibility, or just accept the fact that, you know what, I'm just going to be a selfish human being and I'm just going to look out for myself, and that's how I am okay living my life.
Lots of governments across the world just seem to forget about Afghanistan, but they are spending huge amounts of money. There's a huge driver currently in the world, across the world, for defence spending. There was various meetings over the last few years, and all the inference is we want to spend money on defence and take money away from humanitarian aid that they were given, international development money. You see it from the other side because you see where the need is. What would your message be to some of these governments or some of these people?
I see it from the other side too, because if you talk to, and I'm not talking about sort of the military war machine, but if you talk to any commander who has been on the ground in these sort of, call it insurgent, infested, terrorist safe havens, will also argue that you do not win these wars through military firepower. You win the war when you eliminate that person's reason for wanting to pick up a gun. And you eliminate that person's reason for wanting to pick up a gun by providing them with an alternative. And that alternative always looks like a dignified way forward in life. And that translates to soft power. And the first step of soft power is providing humanitarian assistance. The second step is providing employment, job opportunity, economic growth. None of that involves actually dropping a bomb on top of somebody.
Yeah.
But you're up against the military defense war machine that has its tentacles deep into governments and that, quite frankly, exploits humanity's greatest weakness, which is, selfishness, greed, and this constant sort of search for wealth.
And why do you think, nobody seems to be able to stop the Middle East? This is it's not getting better, it's got worse dramatically. Is it Donald Trump taking over the White House? Is just and I know lots of people who were saying, well, he's only in for a second term, it's his last term. But it seems quite dramatic when the world is not at peace, is it really?
It does seem quite dramatic, but I think what we also need to recognize is that, whether it's Democrats in the White House or Republicans, whether it was Biden or Trump, U.S. policy towards the Middle East, pretty much the same. The difference between the Biden White House and the Trump White House was, quite frankly, in the rhetoric. But if you actually look at the policies and the approach towards Israel, it's pretty much the same. And so the issue isn't, whether it was Donald Trump in the White House or not, as much as it is decades of U.S. foreign policy towards the Middle East. Yeah,
because lots of people would say, have said that Donald Trump is part of the problem. He could push and make sure there's more peace. But you think it's...
So could the Biden administration.
So could, whichever administration. So why do you think there's just not the driver to change things anymore or be outward looking anymore? Because that seems to be part of the problem.
It is a big part of the problem. And it also goes down to, the decades-long, very friendly ties between Israel and the U.S. It goes to sort of decades of, dehumanization of Palestinians and of Arabs and of Muslims. I mean, let's face it, we live in a very, very polarized and, to a certain degree, racist world that is only, getting more so, unfortunately, even though theoretically speaking, like through social media, we're a lot more connected than we used to be. And I also think part of it goes down to a very deeply psychological element. Because if the US were to recognize sort of the depth and breadth and scope of the way that they have been manipulated by Israel, that's a big realization for the country. And to have to admit that, not just now in this post-October 7th era, but rather for decades, the U.S. has not been able to properly capitalize on its relationship with Israel to try to ensure a more enduring, two-state solution option.
Do you think that the American public or any countries in the world will look back and say, actually, we should have done more? Do you think that will happen? When they look back at what happened? Or do you think they're missing this point in history?
I think we missed it post 9/11, and I really thought that, post 9/11, there would have been a sort of self-reckoning to a certain degree in terms of, especially when it comes to the media, but then also within government. How did the media get so overcome with this war drum hysteria that, not only was it, Afghanistan, but then Iraq and, the disaster that Iraq ended up being and all of the realizations that happen right now, and then all of the lessons learned in terms of how, both Afghanistan and Iraq were handled, but then we just saw it repeating itself, once again, post October 7th. I don't know, frankly, but it doesn't matter in the sense that, that's doesn't end up being part of my personal calculus when it comes to why I do what I do. I'm often asked if I have hope. And the thing is no, I don't. I don't have hope, and I don't need hope. But here's the thing: is hope is not my driver. And these situations of hopelessness are very deliberately created. And the minute you realize that you don't need hope to keep doing what you're doing, then whoever's trying to take your hope away loses power.
Sometimes that happens in life where you just don't give up and you just carry on and carry on and carry on. Syria, close to your heart because you've got a link with Syria.
My mom's Syrian.
Yeah. So the situation in Syria, I know you've been a regular visitor to Syria,
yes,
and you're doing work in Syria as well.
Yes, we are doing work in Syria as well. It's very bizarre. It's very strange to be driving around Syria and not be afraid of every single checkpoint. Obviously the honeymoon period is fading and has faded. The needs are great and immense. I don't think anyone really realizes sort of not just what the decade plus of war did to Syria, but even prior to that, how nothing was actually ever properly built up in Syria. But there's also, you still do see a lot of hope and activity among the population and a determination of whatever comes next is going to somehow be better. And if it's not better and if it's not what we want, then we will bring that down too.
So they're sort of giving a bit of time, but not too much time.
There is this understanding that it's going to take time. And Syrians, again, look, they're very savvy. And Syrians, those who fled the country, those who are working in politics, in the opposition outside of Syria, they weren't just sitting around doing nothing. And a lot of them have returned and they've taken up positions within the government, even though they might not necessarily hold the same ideology. You do have, humanitarian organizations, mine included, those that are being led by, Syrian Americans going back.
Big rebuilding job going on, and as much support as possible.
Attempt, yes.
Yeah.
There's a lot of pledges of money. Nothing is actually quite materialized just yet.
Can I say a big, big thank you for you to come into Leicester and to do this show for us, and a big thank you for all the work you do. Really, for humanitarian aid that you're providing in those countries, and going out. I know it's incredibly tough, but there is people out there, I'm sure, who support what you do and will go out of the way to carry on supporting you and the work that you do. Thank you.
No, honestly, thank you. I I appreciate that you give us, the time to talk about this. I appreciate that you care. I appreciate the compassion.
I think Leicester cares as a city.
I was going to just say that, I appreciate the compassion of your listeners and of your community here.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Arwa Damon.